Welcome to the Disabuse Podcast, where we seek to prevent, detect, investigate, and eliminate abuse in churches and faith-based organizations. Today, we are joined by Steve Baughman, a lawyer and author of the 2018 book, Cover Up in the Kingdom, Phone Sex, Lies, and God's Great Apologist, Ravi Zacharias. Steve, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Randal.
So, Steve, for several years, you were, I would say, a voice crying in the wilderness when it came to the character, the person of Ravi Zacharias. But in history, you've been well vindicated. And I really wanted to have you on the podcast to talk about this issue, because Ravi Zacharias, I think, is a classic case of a person who is a predator, who is a manipulator, who is a liar and a fabulist, and who exploited many people within the Christian community along the way. And I think we can learn a lot from his case and what you learned and how you analytically looked at his truth claims, and then ended up doing a significant public critique, which really forced the conversation about Ravi Zacharias. So I'd like to start with a little bit of biography background. How did you originally get interested in the case of Ravi Zacharias and of Ravi as a person?
Sure. Yeah. Although I'm a religious skeptic, now I grew up very profoundly interested in conservative evangelicalism, and grew up around missionaries in Southeast Asia, mainly Southern Baptists. And despite no longer having those beliefs, I've still maintained contact with the apologetic community. I'd like to know that my views are correct. I'd like to stay up in touch with what are the best and the brightest arguments for Christianity happening currently. And in 2015, I happened upon this guy named Ravi Zacharias, who was an extraordinarily impressive individual in terms of his CV and his knowledge, multiple doctorates, connections to academic communities like Cambridge and Oxford. And that got me interested in him because I thought he's the real deal intellectually. And if anyone could present a good defense of the Christian religion, he would probably be one of those people. So I began looking into him, and then I found out that he was by and large a fraud on many counts.
Okay. Now, one thing I just want to say, you said that you're a religious skeptic, and I know you've gotten blowback from people who say, oh, you just have an axe to grind with Ravi Zacharias. You were just trying to take him down. Right at the outset, what do you say to that kind of skeptical response?
I think it's not a good way to question someone's motives for why they believe something, because first of all, as the prophet Jeremiah said, we don't know our own hearts. It's like, I don't know what's going on in the innermost regions of my psyche, the causal mechanisms that give rise to why I believe this and not that. I can tell you that it's sort of insulting to say to a skeptic, you just want to do X, as opposed to your arguments may be based on your own careful consideration of the evidence. It's just a put down, and it kills discussion. If you want to have a discussion with a skeptic, as you well know, Randal, treat them like they have some intellectual stuff to share. We're not just all religious skeptics because we love sinning. I mean, it's a complicated issue, and reasonable minds can disagree on everything, including religion.
I appreciate you quoting Jeremiah just to hammer home a recognition for the blind spots that we all have. But of course, that's true of your critic no less than yourself. Two things I would think I'd want to highlight just from what you said there. One is that person is engaging in an ad hominem fallacy, where they're criticizing you as a person rather than criticizing and analyzing your arguments. And the second thing is it's a genetic fallacy. So they're trying to argue that allegedly your critique is based on an anti-religious bias, and that undercuts the critique. But even if an anti-religious bias motivated your analysis, the analysis stands independent of its originating cause, right?
Yeah, so, maybe I do just hate, I just don't want to keep sinning, but I still have great arguments against the religion. It could be
fair enough. So you made a big claim there, fraud, that he engaged in fraud, or he is a fraud. Let's start by talking about academic credentials. So Ravi Zacharias was associated not only with having a Bachelor of Arts from, I believe, the University of New Delhi, but you also referred to him in your perception as having many doctorates. So how did he mislead people with respect to his credentials? And I'm just going to say, this is one of those examples where I think you can begin to identify a person who is a predator or a manipulator if they lie about relatively smaller things, or they or deceive people or misrepresent themselves. So, how did that you come across the information with respect to Ravi's academic credentials?
Yeah, I'm glad you're asking that because I think this is more important than the sexy sex stuff we'll get into down the road. That for in terms of institutions being able to spot red flags around predators and serious narcissists. Anyone paying attention to Ravi Zacharias before I got involved should have noticed that he was lying through his nose of his Cambridge and Oxford credentials. He called himself a professor at Oxford. It's there on video. It was there at his website. He was no such thing. He'd never been on payroll at Oxford. The people, his colleagues at Oxford, knew he was lying about this, and nobody said anything. Same thing with his folks at Cambridge. When he claimed to have been Cambridge educated, it was utter nonsense. Ravi spent between 6 and 8 weeks auditing classes or sitting in on lectures at Cambridge one summer. He was not ever enrolled at Cambridge.
Let's just unpack that for one moment. So, as I recall, Ravi had said that he studied quantum physics with John Polkinghorne, a well-known Anglican priest and physicist, that he studied quantum physics at Cambridge. Was it something like that?
Ravi made a bunch of Cambridge claims, each of which was just patently false by anyone who wanted to take a look. He claimed to be Cambridge educated, false, never enrolled there. He made this claim widely in speeches, in his book bios, everywhere, at his professional bio. Cambridge educated, never happened. Took quantum physics with John Polkinghorne. I went back and looked at what courses were available when Ravi was spending his time at Ridley Hall, which isn't part of the Cambridge University. It's an Anglican training institute in the town of Cambridge, and Ravi popped on over to the Cambridge campus and listened to some lectures, and that became the basis of all his Cambridge qualifications. But the semester that Ravi was at Ridley Hall, John Polkinghorne taught a class on Buddhism, and he taught a class on the science-religion dialogue. Now, anyone who's taken those kinds of the science-religious dialogue knows that you don't have to know very much about science or religion. Those are introductory classes. Ravi took that class with John Polkinghorne and turned it into having studied quantum physics with the great physicists. It was just bogus, and he got away with it. And the scary thing is that anybody who'd been paying attention should have known, and it turns out there were a lot of people who did know but just didn't speak up.
I think it's so important. As you're pointing out, it's like when people make claims, it doesn't often take a whole lot of effort to research those claims and just begin to track them down. As I said, okay, if he says at this time he researched with John Polkinghorne, go and see, well, what courses were being offered at that time. So I think often there's just this climate of trust within some religious communities that can border on naivete and really make those communities vulnerable to people who are going to exploit them.
Yeah, naivete would be charitable. I think the evidence of Ravi Zacharias just being a bald-faced liar was so overwhelming that it was no longer naivete. It had to be a willful turning away from the truth. And one of your Canadian colleagues, John Stackhouse, gave me a blurb for my book where he mentioned that he's been worried for 20 years that somebody was going to call Ravi Zacharias on his fabulations. 20 years of evangelicals grumbling about this man and nobody saying anything. And I think that's the most significant lesson that Ravi Zacharias has for institutions who are concerned about narcissistic and predatory leaders, is that if there are these little red flags, they may seem minor, but they very often will mask something far more pernicious, like Ravi's flaunting Cambridge and Oxford. It was obviously false. It wasn't the crime of the century, but it definitely was the tip of a very troubling iceberg.
Well, let's talk about a couple more of these. So, like you said, some of these, they're not crimes of the century, but what they can be is a pattern that is indicative of malfeasance, of dishonesty. And that's what we have to often look for, is rather than overlook each incident, kind of look for how they are establishing a pattern of dishonesty or manipulation or malfeasance. So another one, he promoted himself as having won the Asian Youth Preacher Award. What did you learn about that?
Yeah, that was interesting. In his autobiography, Walking from East to West, he just has several pages describing this elaborate, bustling international preaching competition in Hyderabad, I think in 65 or something. Maybe it was 63, I don't remember. And people streaming in from all over Asia. And Ravi, of course, won the preaching competition in a dramatic showdown. Well, I was suspicious enough about this story to look into it, because I noticed that every time you type in the word Asian Youth Preacher Award, it goes right back to Ravi Zacharias. It seems like this is something he invented out of whole cloth. And I was actually able to find all three of the judges who were there in 1965 judging the competition. And all three of them told me that this was an India only competition. It was not an international preaching competition. It was India only. And one of them also described it to me as a little preaching competition. And he'd been asked to be a judge just because he was passing through on a mission. So it really wasn't as big a deal. But Ravi made a big deal out of it in his autobiography. It was something that made him look like a highly credentialed person, and it was a pretty impressive thing to win an international preaching competition. It was false. When I had dinner with Ravi, I brought this up with him, and he told me that he had a trophy mug that he'd be happy to show me, but that the print on it had faded. Well, I went back and looked at my mother's golf trophies from the early 60s, and none of their engraving had faded. So I don't. And then Ravi didn't follow up on his promise to show me some proof that there was that he'd actually won this thing. It was a small thing, but it was part of who he was. He was a liar. He was a shameless self-promoter and didn't care about truth when it came to self-promotion. And the Asian Youth Preacher Award was just one part of him that way.
I think like that example, and also the one you referenced earlier with taking a course he had maybe audited or taken with John Polkinghorne, that's a general introduction course that any undergraduate could have taken, and reframing that as him studying physics with John Polkinghorne, that these are examples of something that has a kernel of truth, which that you embellish it into something that is really quite different. And what that is effective as a manipulator is that there's a degree of authenticity to it, is you can point ultimately back to something if you're ever challenged. And yet the thing to which you're appealing, like you're saying, is actually completely different from what it was promoted later to be. So it is deception, but it's deception that walks a line in terms of a plausible deniability and trying to have some link to something that is veridical. Let's talk about another example, which is similar to that, and that is having a doctorate. You said you thought he had multiple doctorates.
When I first got interested in Ravi, I spent hours online trying to figure out what his doctorates were in. And it took multiple emails with his ministry for me to realize that the man never earned a doctorate. So this was carefully disguised. He used language in his website that was identical to what some universities use to describe their PhD graduates. Honored with a conferral of a doctorate degree and blah, 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 whatever. And it was clear to me that Ravi was using tortured, ambiguous language to cover up the fact that his doctorates were all honorary. All he had to do was follow the protocols and put HON by the doctorate, and everything would have been clean. He didn't do that. He deliberately tried to convey to people that he'd earned academic doctorates, and this was very obvious. And one interesting thing about this is the way his ministry responded to these challenges. They didn't just say mea culpa. They didn't just refer to they doubled down, and they furthered the deceptions in order to cover up his deceptions. And lots of examples of this, but They began saying that Ravi didn't want to be called doctorate. It was just people called him that and he went along with it. But he had Dr. Zacharias on his office, you know. He used it in his book jackets, constantly in his book bios. So to say that Ravi was just sort of polite and humble man who didn't want to offend people by saying, "Don't call me doctor," is just nonsense. But that's the line his ministry gave. And I think that's indicative of an organization that's covering some stuff up. And I would encourage other organizations, if their leaders begin responding this way to criticism by doubling down and being deceptive to cover up their deceptions, that's a red flag right away.
Just to highlight and emphasize what you're saying here with respect to the practice of awarding an honorary doctorate, in academic culture, one does not use, as you're pointing out, an honorific title like that in contexts like on the door of your office or in a bio introducing you, or as Dr. So and so, where that could lead to the misunderstanding that you have an earned doctorate. So that is an important, as you're pointing out, another example where he was exploiting this ambiguity in order to build this persona and give himself power and authority with others and over others. Let's talk about the Lorianne Thompson case. So this was significant in your book, and it turns out this was the tip of the iceberg when it came to his manipulative engagements with women. So what happened there?
Okay, yeah. Before we go into that, if I could just say, based on what we have so far, there were enough red flags. I mean, as you know, the frustrating story for me is nobody in the Christian world cared that Ravi was lying about his credentials. It took a sex scandal to wake Christians up. But to the extent that your viewers are organizations who are concerned about how to spot narcissistic personality disorders and predatory deceptions and all that kind of stuff, misrepresenting one's credentials is a big red flag. And it's probably not the only creepy thing the person has going on in their life if they're doing that. So if Ravi had if he had been a sexual angel, he still would have been a great deceiver. But yes, let's talk about the sex stuff. I think it was my birthday in 2017. I got an email from a confidential source saying Ravi just sued Ms. Thompson, and I went and found the lawsuit and read it, and I realized it was very clear in a horribly drafted legal complaint, bad legal work, that Ravi had an online sexting relationship with a young Canadian woman, a married woman, and that he had threatened suicide to her in writing when she told him, "Ravi, I can't do this anymore. It's killing my soul. I'm going to confess this now to my husband." And he responded with a suicide threat. And that was clear from the lawsuit. I did what I could to get that stuff out. I don't know how serious the Christian world took it, but when they did really wake up was when it turned out Ravi had opened a massage spa, and been sexually abusing the women there. And I was able to interview 3 women who knew great details about it, including Ravi's business partner, or not counting Ravi's business partner, so 3 women and Ravi's business partner. And it wasn't till I put up a video about this online that the Christian world seemed to be shocked about this. Saint Ravi doing this? How can it be? We need to look at this. The credentials didn't bother him. The sex stuff did, and rightly so.
Okay, so since then, Christianity Today reported on this. The RZIM or RZIM Ministries, or ZIM, so they did an investigation with an external investigator, Miller and Martin. They produced a report in February of 2021. What all came of that? What ultimately happened to the ministry itself as well?
Yeah. And I'm okay with you calling it RZIM. So and I know it's always a little awkward. How do we proceed here? Tomato. Yeah. So to their credit, the ministry retained a law firm to do a thorough investigation. and they issued the Miller Report, which found scathing evidence of sexual misconduct by Ravi, amorous texts between him and multiple massage therapists, loving language, at least one nude photo, and this is only on the phones that they were able to get. The whole phones from the Thompson era, the ministry was not able to look at, because Ravi's wife did not give them permission to. So that's a whole different story. But there's still a cover-up going on around Ravi Zacharias with his family. But the Miller Report found lots of examples that Ravi was up to his ears in sexual conduct with women other than his wife. And it was pretty devastating. And what happened when the Miller Report came out, his ministry essentially crumbled, and it no longer exists by its original name. That's a whole other question. Nobody knows what happened to the money, millions and millions of dollars, that is, as far as I'm able to tell, still unaccounted for. But the Christianity Report, in my video, Christianity did a fantastic job reporting on this and investigating it carefully. And that was essentially the end of Ravi Zacharias International Ministries.
Okay, I want to come to one major theme, I think, that we've been touching upon throughout, and that is how Christian organizations relate to this growing pattern of evidence for deception, manipulation, malfeasance, etc. I earlier referred to naivete. You said there's something more going on here. I wanted to just give a quick example here from Acts 17, verses 10 to 12. First of all, the Apostle Paul, goes to the synagogue in Thessalonica, preaches there. They don't like what they're hearing, or some people don't like what they're hearing. He's preaching this new gospel that doesn't fit with their understanding of the Messiah. It's challenging their commonly held and deeply held assumptions. So they don't look at his arguments and evidence. Instead, they drive him out of town. Then he goes to another synagogue in the city of Berea, and we read this. As soon as it was night, the believers sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. On arriving there, they went to the Jewish synagogue. Now the Berean Jews were of more noble character than those in Thessalonica, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures to see if what Paul said was true. And that is the genesis of an expression, to be a good Berean, which means really to exhibit the virtue and the wisdom, to test the claims of people. Don't allow your presuppositions to blind you to the evidence for whatever that evidence seems to be saying, but rather look at that evidence and then draw your conclusions as to what the truth is based upon your evaluation of the evidence, not your preset bias. And I think it's fair to say that time and again, you were running into churches and the ministry, RZIM ministry itself, which was not being a good Berean. So can you say more about what it looks like, what you see in churches where they don't respond effectively, and what it would be like to respond with more wisdom as a good Berean?
Yeah, not really my department, but I think the Ravi Zacharias situation offers a lot of insight into this. First thing, as I said, is look at the non-crime of the century conduct that your leader is engaging in. Do they insist on having doctor on the marquee in front of the church when they only have a doctorate, an honorary doctorate? That is in violation of many colleges. When they confer an honorary doctorate, don't want you using it outside of their organization, but it's misleading. And does your pastor insist on doing that? Maybe that's something to ask why. But also just other red flags. There's a high incidence of narcissistic personality disorder in Canada. The only study I know of was done in Canada, I guess a decade or so ago, and found a shockingly high incidence of narcissism amongst, I think it was male clergymen in Canada. I bet it's even worse in the United States. Maybe something like some sort of screening process for that would be helpful, because it is a real thing. It's a DSM, Diagnostics and Statistics Manual thing, and it affects the behavior. And if you think about it, if I were a narcissist growing up wanting to have lots of attention and power and a regular audience, I could be an athlete. That's nearly impossible to succeed at. I could be a musician or in show business. That's nearly impossible to, or I can start my own church, right?
Yeah.
And lo and behold, I'm here in the south of the United States. Friggin' churches on every corner, everywhere you go, even in the rural areas. Some dude wanted to be his own church leader, and so he started a church right across from this dude over here who started. It's like, couldn't you folks set aside your own personal ambitions and unite around the God you claim to believe in? No, people who are drawn to ministry are often drawn not for idealistic, not for noble reasons. And that's something that I think religious institutions need to quit being so damn naive about. When those pastors come in for their interview and talk about how the Lord is calling me, well, maybe, but let's remember Jeremiah. That pastor doesn't really know that pastor or applicant doesn't necessarily know what's going on in the innermost reaches of their deepest psyche. There could be a whole load of narcissism and self-ambition that's motivating them. And that would be a really important thing to start screening for more. I mean, maybe they do, but I don't know about it. And it sure looks like there are a lot of people falling through the cracks when you look at U.S. ministry and ministry here in the United States and the scandals. So that would be one thing I'd recommend.
I grew up Pentecostal, and within that environment, it's very common for people to say things like, the Lord told me, and that immediately is supposed to grant that person a particular authority in what they're saying because it comes from the Lord. But I learned that a good response to whenever they say the Lord told me is to say, well, he didn't tell me. So you're going to have to find some other independent way to get me to accept your claim apart from you claiming you have divine authority. I mean, as you said, I think the Jeremiah passage has become a common theme in this discussion, is anybody can be mistaken as to what they believe the truth to be. So we should always be open and vulnerable to questioning and challenging. Now, a couple of things. One thing, just come back to RSM. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, just one comment on that.
Yeah.
It's a little more complicated than that if the person saying the Lord told me is your clerical supervisor or one of your spiritual guide, because technically, I guess God speaks through the church. And as one of Ravi Zacharias's little anecdote in his autobiography, a churchman said to him, the Lord wants you to remain with our church. And Ravi said, well, I need to pray about it and see what God wants. And the minister said, Ravi, if the church tells you they want you here, that's God telling you they want you here. So it's a little more complicated given power imbalance and ecclesiastical authority structures. But yes, when someone says, generally speaking, God told me, that's a good response. Well, he didn't tell me. Unless it's your pastor. I don't know.
That's a fair point. And I mean, that highlights one of the reasons, like you talk about perhaps a high ratio of people who have like a narcissism to growth. He has a great book on this, When Narcissism Comes to Church, where he talks about the high rates of narcissism within the clergy. And some of the reasons for that, again, like you said, is anybody can put out a shingle, claim to have God's authority, and then within whatever community grows and develops around them, they could have a really high level of authority. People listen to them every Sunday morning, preach and so on. And it could really become a positive feedback mechanism for narcissistic traits. So definitely something to be concerned about. So a couple of things before we wrap. One thing I'm thinking of, like, is it that people, like, I think I'll put it this way. I think it's easy to think, well, so they just didn't care about the truth. Like RSM didn't care about the truth. They knew all this evidence against Ravi. But I think often it's like people like make one compromise and then they make another. And it's because they want to protect the organization and they don't want to deal with something. And pretty soon they're pretty far down in terms of compromising with a manipulative personality. Do you think it's like that those dynamics can be at play?
I think that's a huge issue, and especially in places like the religious industry. Sorry, don't mean that cynically, but I mean I kind of do, but whatever. I think about those Ravi Zacharias leaders who had PhDs in theology, and they know darn well that if they don't, they have this cushy apologetics where they get to go to speak to auditoriums, and sometimes they're side by side with the great Ravi Zacharias. They knew that if it weren't for that gig, they would be a part-time Sunday school teacher and they'd be stocking shelves at Home Depot on weekend nights. Those are their alternatives in life. So I can't say I blame them for not wanting to see the obvious truths about their ticket to cushy apologetics careers. To stand up to Ravi would have meant a big sacrifice. But I mean, Christians used to stand down the lions. Now they can't speak up because they're concerned about their careers. I mean, I'd encourage more Christians to look at that when they're parts of organizations where there's something fishy going on. Again, not my department, but I wish that would happen more.
Yeah. I will say I had some conversations with people in our Zim in the midst of all this when the evidence was building, and I was really hammering, I would say, on this point of them confronting the evidence that you had identified in particular, and others as well, and just the patterns that were emerging. And I would say, I'll say a couple things. So first, in their defense, it's not that cushy, the jobs they have. Ravi's was, he was doing very well for himself. I think most employees were not. But I think it does lead to an understandable fear. And I'm sympathetic with that, to speak out when it creates all this uncertainty about the future of your employment. I can understand the fear and reluctance people have to do that. Having said that, as you said, Christians have stared down lions. Do we not trust God enough to speak truth to power and speak out against abusive and harmful patterns of behavior and so on, and cover-ups of the truth? Do we not trust enough to do the right thing there? Because again, if you're not faithful in the truth in the small things, can you really be faithful in the truth in the big things?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a legitimate, a big issue. I mean, I can't really judge because I've never been in that situation where my career, I got to taken a stand of integrity, or else there's going to be big downsides, or there will be a big downside in my life if I take this stand of integrity. But I can't help but think that if I really believe that in a God who has his eye on the sparrow, those decisions would be a lot easier. And I wonder, as an outsider looking in, an atheist, skeptic, and all that, how much do you guys really believe that you have a God who's got his eye on the sparrow? Because if you did, you wouldn't need to stay with RZIM once all the bad stuff has come to light. But again, it's something that I wonder about a lot. Yeah.
That's a fair question. Steve, I want to thank you for joining us today. It's been great. And I want to thank you in particular for the fact that you were that voice crying in the wilderness, 6 years ago now, 7 years ago, when you were laying a foundation for all the critical analysis of Ravi that would come afterwards, and providing us with a real wake-up call within the broader Christian community and within religious communities to become more aware of people that are engaging in these patterns of deception and manipulation. So really want to thank you for that and for joining us today.
Thanks, Randall. And I'd like to thank you for being one of the very few true Christian Bereans when this evidence came out. You were very courageous and fair with the evidence, and you didn't take sides right away, but you did express concern, and that took a lot of courage. So thank you for that.
Thanks. It's been great.